Imagine this. You're walking through life, doing your best, pushing through challenges, trying to show up with integrity. Then, out of nowhere, someone hits you. Not physically, but deeply, emotionally. Maybe they lied. Maybe they betrayed your trust. Maybe they tore down what you spent years building. And in that moment, you feel anger, humiliation, pain, like a fire rising up your spine. The ancient circuitry in your brain screams one thing: fight back. Take revenge. Make them feel what they made you feel. But what if I told you that your brain in that exact moment is lying to you? I'm not here to give you a moral lesson. I'm here to give you neuroscience, the truth about how your brain and body respond to pain, betrayal, and revenge. Because if someone hurts you deeply and you react with revenge, you're not just punishing them. You're also reinforcing the trauma loop in yourself. When you obsess over getting even, your brain activates the stress circuitry, especially the amygdala and the hypothalamus. Your cortisol levels spike. Your prefrontal cortex, the rational, strategic part of your brain, gets hijacked. You're no longer responding with intelligence. You're reacting with survival instincts wired for a world of predators and prey. That's not power, that's primitive. Now here's the part that most people never hear. The most biologically empowering thing you can do when someone hurts you isn't revenge, it's transmutation. What do I mean? I mean converting pain into fuel, taking the emotional blow and turning it into a neurochemical signal to grow stronger, faster, smarter. It's not about forgiving and forgetting. That's passive. This is active. This is you saying, I will use this energy to evolve. Let's get very clear here. Resilience isn't just a mindset. It's a set of neural pathways you build through repetition. When you choose not to take revenge, when you choose instead to focus on your craft, your goals, your mission, your brain learns that it doesn't need to burn itself down to feel powerful. It learns emotional self-regulation. It grows the connections between your limbic system and your prefrontal cortex. And those connections, that's where real strength lives. That's where high performers are made. So when someone tries to crush you, hurt you, humiliate you, don't fantasize about how you'll strike back. Fantasize about how unstoppable you'll become. Visualize the version of you who doesn't just survive the storm, they study the storm, they harness it, and they build wind turbines from the wreckage. So the next time you get hurt so badly that you feel like breaking something or breaking someone, remember, the greatest revenge is not destroying them, it's designing you at a level so elevated they can't even reach to pull you down again. When you're hurt, especially deeply, unexpectedly, it's important to understand what's happening inside your brain. Most people don't realize that the immediate desire for revenge is not a conscious strategic choice. It's not even about justice. It's a biological reflex. The amygdala, which is the part of your brain responsible for detecting threats and initiating fear and aggression responses, lights up almost instantly. That signal then moves through the hypothalamus and activates your sympathetic nervous system. Heart rate increases, pupils dilate, muscles tense, and your entire system prepares for confrontation. In evolutionary terms, this made sense. You were wired to defend your tribe, your territory, your survival. But here's the catch. Your brain doesn't know the difference between a physical threat and a social or emotional one. When someone betrays you, disrespects you, lies to you, it triggers the exact same fight or flight circuitry as if you were being attacked in the wild. The ancient brain says, retaliate now, protect your status, show them you're not weak. This is powerful neurobiology at play, and if you're unaware of it, it will hijack your rational mind. That's why people often regret how they reacted in anger. It wasn't them. It was a cascade of neurochemicals taking control of the system. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. When you act on that revenge impulse, you get a hit of dopamine. The brain rewards that behavior, not because it's good, but because it sees it as a successful threat response. And that reinforcement loop wires in more quickly than you think. You're essentially teaching your nervous system, when I feel pain, I cause pain. That's not power, that's programming. And unless you interrupt it, it becomes your default. You'll live your life responding to every hurt with a reaction that feels strong in the moment, but leaves you biologically drained and emotionally stuck. This is the very moment where awareness becomes your leverage point, not just psychologically, but neurologically. Because to break that cycle, you need to out-evolve your own brain. Now let's take this one level deeper. When someone hurts you and you act on that hurt by retaliating, you're not actually releasing the pain. You're reinforcing it. Here's why. Every time you recall the event, every time you replay what they did or what you should have said or done, your brain and body don't just remember the experience, they relive it. The same stress hormones, cortisol, norepinephrine, adrenaline, flood your system again. You are literally teaching your nervous system that the trauma is still happening. This isn't philosophical, it's neurobiological conditioning. And what's worse, when you finally act out, whether through revenge, passive aggression, or emotional outbursts, you're not closing the wound, you're carving it deeper. This is because behavior shapes biology. When you react with vengeance, you create a pattern. That pattern becomes a circuit. Neurons that fire together wire together. So your brain starts linking pain with retaliation. That might sound like control, but it's the opposite. You're giving the person who hurt you permanent access to your mental and emotional real estate. Even when they're gone, your body keeps reacting like they're still right there. This is how trauma becomes chronic. Not because of what happened, but because of how it's encoded through repeated emotional reactions. And it doesn't stop there. Studies in neuroplasticity show that high levels of prolonged stress actually shrink the hippocampus, responsible for memory and emotional regulation, and increase the reactivity of the amygdala. You literally become more prone to overreact, more sensitive to threats, and less able to think clearly. Revenge might feel like a release in the moment, but what it's really doing is solidifying your identity around the injury. That becomes your story, your lens, your filter, and over time, it narrows your perspective and erodes your ability to choose a different path. So you're not just reinforcing the pain, you're turning it into your blueprint. That's the cost of revenge. It trades short-term dominance for long-term damage. And unless you're actively aware of this mechanism, you might mistake that initial feeling of power for actual healing. But they're not the same, not even close. Now here's where the shift happens, not emotionally but neurologically. When you feel hurt and that surge of anger or the desire for revenge kicks in, you have a small window of opportunity. In that window, your brain is highly plastic. It's primed to rewire based on how you respond. If you resist the urge to retaliate, if you pause, if you choose not to act impulsively, you're not being weak. You're engaging the most evolved part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex. This region is responsible for executive function, decision-making, long-term planning, and emotional regulation. And when you activate it in the heat of emotional stress, you're not just making a better choice, you're building a stronger brain. This is neurobiological strength. Every time you override a reactive impulse, the neural pathway between your emotional centers, like the amygdala, and your prefrontal cortex becomes stronger. It's like building a bridge. At first, it's shaky, fragile, uncertain. But over time, with repetition, it becomes the dominant route. And that matters because the brain follows efficiency. It will take the path that's most well practiced. So when someone hurts you and you choose regulation instead of retaliation, you're literally reshaping your future emotional responses, not by suppressing anything, but by elevating your system's level of control. This is the foundation of real resilience, not just grit or toughness, but neurological integration. You're teaching your brain that it doesn't have to be ruled by old patterns. And this isn't something abstract. It shows up in functional MRI scans. People who practice this kind of control show increased gray matter in the prefrontal cortex and decreased reactivity in the amygdala. That means less overthinking, less emotional volatility, more clarity, and more grounded confidence. So when you feel like doing something destructive in response to being hurt, remember, choosing not to react is not avoidance. It's not softness. It's training. It's performance at the neurological level. You're literally forging a new identity, one that's not driven by wounds, but by mastery. The real power begins when you learn to take that emotional energy, the anger, the sadness, the betrayal, and convert it into something useful. This is what I mean by transmutation. It's not a metaphor, it's neurochemical. When someone hurts you, your body produces a spike in stress chemicals, cortisol, norepinephrine. But it also increases activity in the areas of the brain associated with motivation and action. That's a biological opportunity. Most people waste it by looping in anger or obsessing over revenge, but if you understand the system, you can redirect that energy. You can turn pain into precision, hurt into hunger. That is transmutation. Think of it like this. Your nervous system doesn't actually care why you're emotionally activated. It just knows you're in a heightened state. So the question becomes, what are you going to do with that activation? Will you let it rot into resentment, or will you channel it into momentum? The same neural and hormonal fuel that could be used to destroy someone can be redirected to rebuild yourself. And not just rebuild, redefine. The pain becomes a neurological charge, and what you attach that charge to, your business, your craft, your health, your mission, that's what grows. So there's a concept in neuroscience called experience-dependent plasticity. It means the brain changes based on what you do while you're in a heightened state of emotion or attention. So when you feel that raw, visceral energy from being hurt, and instead of reacting, you step into work, into progress, into creating, your brain locks in that association. It begins to rewire. Now, pain equals progress. Now, hurt equals action. This is not about repressing emotion. It's about strategically repurposing it. This is how you turn a breakdown into a breakthrough, not by waiting to feel better, but by using what you're already feeling. That's what the highest performers in the world do, whether they know it or not. They transmute emotional intensity into measurable output. And the more you do it, the more instinctual it becomes, until eventually, pain doesn't derail you anymore. It becomes your starting signal. Here's something most people completely overlook. Resilience isn't just a trait you're born with. It's a skill your brain builds through repetition. That's the power of neuroplasticity. Every time you resist the urge to act out of pain, every time you override the emotional reflex to retaliate, you are carving a new pathway in your nervous system. And this isn't about just being positive or staying calm. It's about reps. Just like training a muscle, the more often you respond with intention instead of impulse, the more automatic that control becomes. You're not just coping, you're upgrading the architecture of your brain. The key lies in something called long-term potentiation. When neurons fire together repeatedly, especially in emotionally charged moments, they form stronger synaptic connections. That means if in moments of stress, you practice stillness, composure, redirected focus, your brain begins to default to those responses. You no longer have to try to stay calm. You've trained for it. You've earned it neurologically. And that's a massive shift in how you experience adversity. Now consider this. Most people practice the opposite without realizing it. They practice resentment, they practice overthinking, they practice emotional reactivity, and those patterns become hardwired too. That's why breaking out of the revenge loop feels so difficult, because the brain has made it efficient. But just like any habit, it can be reconditioned. The hard part is staying consistent in the early stages when the new circuits are still weak. But if you stay with it, those responses become robust. And that's when everything changes. Because now, when someone hurts you, instead of spiraling into old emotional reflexes, your nervous system knows what to do. It doesn't panic, it doesn't lash out, it processes the signal and pivots into action. That's not just resilience, that's neural performance. It's what separates people who remain stuck in cycles of pain from those who use adversity as fuel to rise. And once your brain learns how to do this consistently, you don't just feel stronger, you become fundamentally unshakable. When you get hurt and you choose to focus on your mission instead of revenge, you're doing something far more profound than just moving on. You are redirecting your brain's reward system, specifically the dopaminergic circuitry that governs motivation, focus, and sustained drive. The human brain is built to pursue goals. Dopamine isn't just about pleasure, it's about anticipation, effort, and progress. And here's what most people don't realize. When you lock onto a purpose, when you shift your attention from the person who hurt you to the outcome you're building toward, your brain begins to release dopamine in response to that forward movement. Now contrast that with revenge. You get a short-term spike, maybe even a sense of satisfaction, but it crashes fast. It doesn't give you a pathway to build on. It's not progressive, it's reactive. But when you attach your emotional energy to a vision, a mission, a goal that's aligned with who you want to become, the dopamine becomes renewable. That's how you create sustainable momentum. You train your brain to find reward not in retaliation, but in results. This shift also activates what neuroscientists call the task-positive network, the brain's focus and goal-directed circuit. It's the opposite of the default mode network, which is where rumination and overthinking live. So when you focus on your mission, you're not just distracting yourself, you're restructuring your mental state. You're moving out of emotional chaos and into neural coherence. And what's powerful is that the more you repeat this, the more your brain craves it. You begin to associate adversity with opportunity, pain with performance. Instead of being hijacked by negative emotional loops, your system gets pulled forward by purpose. That's not toxic positivity, that's neurochemical mastery. You're not ignoring the hurt, you're just alchemizing it into something that actually builds you. So when someone tries to bring you down, you don't need to react, you just need to refocus. Because your reward system, your focus, your biology, they all start working for you instead of against you. That's when progress becomes inevitable. Your nervous system is not just a passive observer of your emotional life, it's an active participant. It listens, adapts, and rewires itself based on the decisions you make repeatedly. When you choose to dwell on pain, when you obsess over the person who wronged you, your body memorizes that pattern. Your heart rate variability changes, your breathing becomes more shallow, your baseline stress levels rise. That becomes your new normal. But, and this is critical, when you make the decision to refocus, to channel your attention into something constructive, your entire physiological state shifts. You teach your nervous system a new rhythm, that rhythm becomes your edge. What people don't often realize is that your internal state, your breath, your posture, your heart rate, feeds back into your brain. It's a loop. When you act calm, breathe deep, and direct your thoughts forward, your brain interprets that as safety. The limbic system downregulates. Your prefrontal cortex steps back into control. You literally become more capable of thinking clearly, solving problems, and maintaining composure, not because you're avoiding what happened, but because you're stabilizing your biology. This is not about staying positive. This is about training regulation. High performers, whether in athletics, leadership, or creativity, aren't great because they don't feel stress. They're great because they've trained their nervous systems to remain coherent under stress. They can take a hit, feel it fully, and still move forward with precision. That's what you're doing every time you choose not to engage in revenge. You're telling your body, we don't spiral, we adapt, and over time, that adaptation becomes default. Your reactions slow down, your awareness speeds up, you become less triggerable, more intentional. That's the beginning of internal authority. And once you start operating from that place, it doesn't matter who tries to provoke you, you've already moved beyond the level where they can access your nervous system. You've trained yourself to respond, not react. That's real control, that's real freedom. Emotional self-regulation isn't just some personality trait that a lucky few are born with. It's a trainable biological function. Your ability to stay grounded, to not lash out when you're triggered, to not let someone else's behavior hijack your system, comes down to how well your brain can communicate with your body under stress. And the bridge between those two systems, the emotional centers like the amygdala and the rational control centers like the prefrontal cortex, gets stronger with practice. That means every single time you resist the temptation to retaliate, you're not just making a moral choice, you're strengthening a neurological circuit. This is a skill, and like any skill, it builds through repetition under pressure. The key is to interrupt the automatic pattern. When you feel that emotional spike, tight chest, clenched jaw, racing thoughts, that's your signal. That's your training ground. Most people see that moment as overwhelming, but you can actually use it as a cue to engage regulation. Whether it's through breathing protocols, visual anchoring, or simply delaying action by a few seconds, you're putting space between stimulus and response. And that space, that pause, is where neuroplasticity lives. You're giving your brain the chance to choose instead of just react. And here's the beauty of the nervous system. It remembers. If you regulate once, it becomes easier to regulate again. The synapses between those key regions in the brain start to strengthen. Over time, you build what's called top-down control. That's when your higher order thinking systems begin to dominate the emotional ones, not by suppressing emotion, but by integrating it. You still feel everything, but you don't become the emotion. That's the difference. And what's wild is that this control doesn't just help you avoid reacting badly, it increases your capacity for everything. Focus, empathy, clarity, even physical performance. Because when your system is regulated, your full cognitive bandwidth becomes available. You stop leaking energy into anger and start channeling it into action. That's the reward of emotional training. It's not just peace, it's power. Revenge may feel satisfying in the moment, but the truth is, it doesn't produce long-term results. In fact, it often leaves you empty, exhausted, and stuck in the very loop that caused you pain. You get a temporary spike in dopamine, a quick hit of satisfaction, but that wears off quickly. The problem is that rush doesn't last, and what follows is a crash. Your brain returns to its baseline, but now the emotional residue is still there, unresolved. The cycle is complete, but the injury hasn't been healed. You've spent energy, emotional and physiological, for nothing more than a brief sense of relief. Think about it this way. When you engage in revenge, you're reacting to the past, reliving old pain, and reinforcing your identity as a victim. But when you channel your energy into progressing toward your goals, whether personal, professional, or relational, you're responding to the future. You're building a new self. You're not trapped in a cycle of reactivity. You've broken free to move forward. This shift doesn't just improve your emotional state, it changes your brain's wiring. You literally become a different person, one who isn't defined by past wounds, but by the future you're creating. This is the essence of true strength. It's not about feeling powerful in the moment, it's about using every challenge to craft a version of yourself that's unshakable, resilient, and perpetually moving toward your highest potential. That's the kind of power that lasts. When someone hurts you, the natural instinct is often to seek revenge or to make them feel what you're feeling. But what if, instead of sinking into the drama and bitterness, you focused all that energy into becoming so good that they no longer matter? This is where true power lies. Instead of being consumed by anger, sadness, or resentment, you use the experience as fuel to elevate yourself to become more than you were before. Here's the science behind that idea. Your brain operates in a way that's highly responsive to your goals. When you focus your attention on achieving something, especially something that demands your full attention and effort, your brain releases neurochemicals that fuel your perseverance. You feel more alive, more driven, and more capable. That's dopamine at work, the neurochemical reward for progress and goal achievement, right? So by focusing on becoming your best self, you're actually rewarding your brain with sustained motivation and satisfaction that is far more powerful and lasting than the fleeting satisfaction of revenge. But here's the deeper neurological impact. As you continue to improve, as you keep honing your skills, deepening your knowledge, and raising your performance, your identity begins to shift. You no longer identify as the person who is hurt or the victim of some wrongdoing. You begin to embody a new identity, the identity of someone who is focused on growth, mastery, and excellence. This becomes your default mode. You begin to build an internal reference point where your validation comes from within, not from outside events or people who might try to bring you down. As you rise to higher levels of achievement, the people who once hurt you become irrelevant. Not because you've defeated them, but because you've outgrown the need for validation from external sources. You become so deeply rooted in your own sense of purpose, strength, and direction that the idea of revenge no longer even resonates with you. You've reached a level where their actions no longer define you because you are defining yourself through your growth, your excellence, and your resilience. That's the most powerful kind of revenge, the kind that isn't about tearing someone down, but about